good evening to you all, and thank you for coming to a seminar on a Friday afternoon. Great to see you all. Those of you that don't know me, I'm Justin Frazzini. I'm the adjunct professor of Robert J. Abernathy, adjunct professor of constitutional law, and I teach constitutional development and democratization in the first semester, and law and institutions of the EU in the second semester. And I also direct our Center for Constitutional Studies and Democratic Development, which is playing a role tonight because given the topic, which is, as you know, Mexico, from liberal democracy to return of authoritarian rule after 2024, we are co-sponsoring this event because it is very relevant to a research project that we have as part of the International Association of Constitutional Law on constitutionalism in liberal democracies. And before I introduce my esteemed colleague who will be the speaker tonight, I just wanted to read the following. As scholars dedicated to the study and practice of constitutional law, we express our deepest concern about the constitutional reform of the judiciary that is currently under consideration by the Mexican Congress. A measure that only at the federal level will impact around 1,600 federal judges and the 11 members of the Supreme Court. In particular, we are concerned about the implications that the popular election of judges will entail for judicial independence, the rule of law, and the protection of rights and liberties in Mexico. Judicial independence is the cornerstone of constitutional democracies and the rule of law. It guarantees stability, predictability, and impartiality in the process of judicial decision-making. Replacing a merit-based judicial selection process with a system that disregards relevant experience and allows candidate selection to be driven by electoral and party politics only, not only contravenes the safeguards that judicial independence seek to protect, but also undermines the Republican values that uphold a constitutional democracy. If judicial independence cannot be guaranteed, the ability of Mexico's legal system to impartially administer justice, as well as to protect the rights and liberties of its citizens, will also be severely threatened. This is an open letter on Mexico's judicial reform seeking to introduce the popular election of judges, signed by a series of eminent constitutionalists and published on the webpage of the International Association of Constitutional Law, and it kind of underlines the gravity of the situation concerning Mexico, and it looks as if once again we are in what we might call a form of democratic backsliding, but if you like, we could also call it a reverse wave, making reference to Samuel Huntington, who I know was an important inspiration for Francisco in writing his book. And let us now turn to our speaker. Francisco González, as you probably know, is Associate Professor of International Political Economy and Latin American Politics at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He earned his master's and doctoral degrees in politics from the University of Oxford. And among other things, while he's been at SAIS, he has for two times been the recipient of the SAIS Max Fisher Prize for Excellence in Teaching. His publications include the most recent, and I think this will be in part the object of today's seminar, Mexico Under Misplaced Monopolies, Concentrated Wealth and Growing Violence from the 1980s to the Present, published with Routledge. And in particular, and allow me to actually show you the book, 2008, Transitions from Authoritarian Rule, Institutionalized Regimes in Chile and Mexico, 1970 to 2000, published with Johns Hopkins University Press. Now, I just want to underline, in particular with reference to this groundbreaking book of 2008, among the reviews, it is underlined that González's book contributes to the rich literature on dual transitions that began close to 20 years ago. The author presents a plausible explanation for the manner in which Mexico and Chile moved from authoritarianism and state-led economic policies to market-led democracies. And it goes on to underline that this is a valuable contribution to the study of Latin American politics. Another review talks about Francisco González's analysis being an intelligent analysis of the process of dual transitions in Chile and Mexico, and it has a strong Huntingtonian overtone. I'm not sure whether I pronounced that well, but that was the reason why I made reference to waves of democratization earlier. The statistics, however, as I was saying, show that we would appear to be in a reverse wave right now, and it looks as though Mexico is no exception. In other words, our speaker tonight, to use a soccer metaphor, est un crack, okay, a true expert of Latin American studies, and the floor is yours, Francisco.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Justin. Wow, a crack. I've never been called by that. Not my children, whenever we're playing football. Papi, eres tan malo, you're so bad. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been full-time faculty at Johns Hopkins University for 19 years, since 2005. But my initial contact with Hopkins happened, in fact, here in Bologna. I was just a young obviously person doing a postdoc, and the school needed a lecturer on Latin American political economy. I applied and was lucky enough to get the job, and so I commuted between Oxford and Bologna for 3 years. Some of the happiest, brightest, freshest years in my life as I now look at things. So it's really always very nice to come back to the first place where I started my career with Johns Hopkins. I'm Mexican, and I study not just Mexico, but Mexico is one of the countries that I follow closely. And of course, there is a lot of talk, not just about Mexico, other big countries like Brazil, like Argentina, or emerging market countries around the world, China, India, South Africa, and the state of democracy, the extent to which there is potentially a reversal wave or democratic backsliding, our democracies weakening. There are obviously no grand generalization, there's no silver bullet that could allow one to answer that question for all countries. Just to highlight, Mexico is particularly relevant to the extent that it's a big emerging market country, 130 million people, with more than 40 million diaspora, 40 million Mexican Americans in the United States. Indeed, if you go around Southwest US, cultural, historical, culinary Mexican tradition is very much alive and continues to grow. The country shares a 3,000 plus land kilometer border with the United States, which makes it unique, but not unique. Canada has an even longer one. But in terms of the cultures, the civilizations that meet in those two lines, the line between US and Canada are more similar in terms of human makeup than the one that connects Mexico and the United States. So Mexico traditionally is put in a specific and separate basket in United States foreign policy, and is considered a place where whatever's going on, good, neutral, bad, has potential implications for US national security. So that is important to the extent that we are in a US, an American university in Italy. There is a strong connection with the US. Mexico, and it's not me, other authors call it the US soft underbelly, which I believe is a very interesting image because it highlights vulnerability. So whatever happens there is important for the US. And if it's important for the US, it's going to end up being at least indirectly important for the world. So today I just want to discuss what's the state of Mexican democracy. I'm going to go over history. I want to be pretty focused and follow the script. First, following Justin's very kind introduction, saying that yes, the work I'm doing currently is still based on work I last published in book form in 2019. That this is important because what I've been trying to do is to continue to look at my country with the same framework, similar concepts. So this last presidency between 2018 and 2024, I want to see it through the light of this perspective. What is this perspective? One, and there are two tracks, a political track and an economic track. The political track is that of a country which managed to go through a gradual process of pacted transition. Pacted because different political groups got together time and again, several iterations between the mid-1970s and the mid-1990s to allow for a more open, less uneven playing field for political parties. So in exchange for support for a government that ruled single party, although democratic elections, at least on paper, many parties were allowed to compete, a single group that rules for 7 decades, civilian, not military, and to the extent that since the 1980s, there are particularly big economic financial problems, this group in power is time and again reaching out to the opposition and saying, in exchange for continuing to support our change from closed to open economy, early days of so-called globalization, mid-1980s, late 1980s, we shall give you the opposition, particularly the center-right, the conservative side of the spectrum, PAN, Partido Acción Nacional, National Action Party. We share this view about the future of the economy, its integration, its globalization. You support us, we open up more the electoral space. And so this is something that happens between 70s and 90s. It's relatively well structured. Most of the actors played that game, decided that, okay, this is a channel to liberalize a relatively closed political regime. Let's do it. So it's not only PAN, the traditional conservative, but also the left. And the main left back then is PRD, the Partido Revolución Democrática. So we have gradual move on the political track from closed to open political system. Moving to the second track is economic one. Mexico, like most other countries in Latin America, indeed in the South world, at some point in the course of the 50s or 60s, undertook big-scale projects to try to develop industry of their own, not just to import all manufactured goods or knowledge to just buy it from the US or Canada or Western European countries or Japan, South Korea. Countries in Latin America also wanted to do this. And particularly countries big in size in terms of population, land mass, factor endowments. Some of them ended up with quite significant capabilities to get domestic industry to take off. But this took off thanks to protection. So we are in a case of, like many European countries, like the US, during part of its history, domestic protection to allow for domestic producers to not just engage in extractive activity. It's not just extracting oil and gas or mining, industrial mining, precious metals. No, let's also manufacture, and let's also do services. Let's, in other words, modernize. So a lot of this modernization took place under a closed, relatively closed system. High trade protection, capital controls. There was no freedom of movement for capital, and that seems to have worked relatively well between the 1950s and the 1970s. At which point, many of the countries, particularly in the region of interest, Latin America, ended up highly over-indebted with tremendous external debts. 1982 is the year. And from then on, in Latin America, we have, in fact, a concept for what happened afterwards, and we know it as the lost decade, la década perdida, the lost decade in social and economic development. A dramatic crisis comparable to what happens in other regions of the world when there is war, when in these countries there wasn't war, but there was a dramatic 5-7 year economic crisis. So political track and economic track end up forcing towards opening, from closure to opening. But it's done in a gradual manner. Sorry about that. So political track, negotiated opening, and painful because it's based on dramatic financial economic crisis. A change
Sister,
from...
the only thing is that we have on the line, so
Sorry.
just bear in mind. Yeah, sorry.
Not at all, thank you. From closed to open economy. The end result is that we have a country that was authoritarian and now is democratic, and that tended to be quite inward looking and now is open. This is a 20+ year process. But the end result is not ending up with a liberal democracy like the US or like France or like Switzerland. We end up in a situation which I call misplaced monopolies. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Before that, let me put Mexico within the regional perspective in terms of these two tracks, the political and the economic. This is Latin America sometime in the 1970s, 75, 1976. Most of the countries in the region were authoritarian and followed either statist economic policy making, and there were some very repressive military regimes that had started pioneering what later came to be known as the neoliberal paradigm. There you see Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina. These are, of course, not all the countries in the region. The fact that all of them are on the side of authoritarianism does not mean that all of Latin America was authoritarian. I was interested in the authoritarians who then experienced transitions to democracy. But even back then, there were some democracies in the region, continue to be democracy, Costa Rica, Venezuela, Colombia. But a majority of the countries are under different varieties of authoritarian rule, military or civilian based. So that's, snapshot number one. Fast forward 2.5 decades, and at the turn of this century, all of these countries, which before were ruled in an authoritarian fashion, and a majority under closed protectionist economic policy, have in fact migrated at least to the idea of democracy. And we can discuss liberal democracy, electoral democracy, illiberal democracy. There's democracy with a variety of adjectives. Let's say that for this, the main issue is in these countries, the basic idea of free and fair elections regularly prescribed in law every 2, every 3, every 4, etc. years is happening, and the people in charge of those elections are relatively neutral and the outcomes are fair in that they reflect what majorities voted for. So this is a very important change in the entire region, not just Mexico. Mexico was one of the countries where the political class back then enthusiastically embraced the idea of these changes, opening gradually politically through quid pro quos with the opposition, at the same time that the country started opening up economically, in particular with the idea of becoming integrated with the United States economy. Canada plays, a marginal role. It's important in some sectors, particularly automobiles, transportation, supply networks. Mexico, US, Canada are incredibly integrated. But back in the 90s, the political class in Mexico wants to join the US. So that's the meaning of globalization in Mexico. It wasn't opening up to everyone. It was, we will integrate with the United States. So this is a difference. That's not just Mexico, as I've shown. It's a majority of countries moving from authoritarian to democratic rule, and a majority of them also moving from closed to more open economies. What is this issue, this pathology, so to speak, misplaced monopolies? Well, if we think about it again in terms of quadrants, these are situations in which, on the one hand, political track, the state loses its monopoly over the legitimate use of persuasion, force, coercion. More actors are able to exercise forced persuasion or force or coercion, and these are private groups. It's not the government. That's a key attribute of a modern nation state. Alongside this hollowing out of the state and other actors, non-state actors, being able to exercise some of these prerogatives, which should just be for the state, we have a situation in which, in particular, the domestic economy remains very concentrated. So even though 1980s, 1990s, even 2000s, a majority of people in power in Mexico would say, hey, we've opened up. Everyone should be clapping. Mexico is open for business. We're one of the countries with the largest number of free trade agreements with individual countries or sub-regions. We're very open. Yes, you're very open, the external side of the economy. The domestic structure remains very concentrated. And this concentration is not just, a critique of oligarchs, private capitalist raiders taking over. No, it applies to both public and private sector. It's not just the big oligarchs or the billionaires. It's also the very well top-placed politicians, technocrats, their foreign partners in business, well-placed top labor leaders. So it's not just capitalist versus labor. This is insiders versus outsiders. And within the insiders, you're going to have from oligarchs to leaders of trade unions to the top members of private equity or hedge funds in New York who hold, dozens of billions of Mexican debt, and who potentially at some point can dump all that debt if they don't like what you're doing. The main point is we end up with why misplaced monopolies? Well, in a classical political economy, we are told that on the political track, we want the state to have a relative monopoly over the legitimate use of persuasion or coercion. This is lacking here. The state has been hollowed out. It's weak. Parts of it have been captured either by powerful economic interests connected to industry services in the US, or likewise powerful interests very much connected to the land, to deep Mexico, to rural Mexico, a thriving, incredibly dangerous criminal economy. So we have a weak state. We lost that monopoly, which was there before, but maybe one of the prices to pay was you can have a strong state, but it's going to be authoritarian. You're not going to be able to choose freely and fairly who you want to be president, how you want your Congress to look, the balance between left, center, right. So we have hollow state, and then going to the economic track, without being doctrinaire and embracing either pure free markets or just pure statism, command economy. No, I think you have to go trial and error, learning by doing, and each economic sector is different. So these one-size-fits-all strategies, which both the traditional statists as well as the traditional neoliberals have tried to impose. Well, in the case of Mexico, they do this, but just on the external sector. Here, I think this is a graphic representation. Left-hand side, political track, authoritarian years, both are closed. The state is in the hands of one party. The president in turn, whoever is president, is head of state, head of government, head of hegemonic party, commander-in-chief of armed forces. Regime, it's closed because one party, in spite of how people vote, have ensured in an incredibly hypocritical Mexico-Latino way a victory with token representation for the opposition. Left hand down, the economic back then, likewise, both sectors relatively closed. Trade protection, capital controls, so the international part is closed, and the domestic, very concentrated. A few very big capitalists, many of them intimately linked with the state. There's a saying in Mexico between 1930s, 1940s, a new capitalist class was born, a class that was born after a Mexican revolution, a social revolution as dramatic as the Soviet or the Chinese, 1910, 1920. A new capitalist class is born, but they are tied at the hip. They're very close to the politicians and the bureaucrats. They're part of that bloc. So we have very concentrated domestic economy. The right-hand side shows the openings. So on the political side, we see the regime with these successive electoral reforms, allowing more and more opposition to participate, less unequal playing field. Internationally, the state is hollowed out. It opens up, but by opening up, it ends up being captured, not just by the big capitalists, particularly since the late 1980s, early 1990s, by organized criminal groups who engage in transnational organized crime, and who today conservatively probably control on the ground a third of municipalities. 1,500 municipalities in a country of 130 million people, close to 2 million square kilometers, a third plus controlled by criminal organized crime. This is something that I, at 55 years of age, find incredible. The country I grew up in and the country I left in the mid-90s was very different from this one. But, well, you never know the extent to which historical change can happen. In this case, we've had big changes. Economically, we see the opening internationally, freedom of movement for capitals, a lot of foreign direct investment, open to trade, big integration of supply chains, particularly manufacturing, with the United States. but no real reforms to the domestic side of the economy. So the big capitalists, private or state capitalists, remain in that position. This is what we end up with. Here's an either or. If you're not suffering from the pathology I described as misplaced monopolies, if you think about average everyday life, and of course, it's easy to stereotype, but think about everyday life in the Netherlands or in the UK or in Germany or in the US. And so what you will see is something that is known as open access and is connected to this political and economic track. The left-hand side shows there effective rule of law, a state that is able to monitor, evaluate, carry out law enforcement. Probably no perfect places, but this is a question of degrees. That's the political track, where you need that monopoly of rule of law. The state is in charge. On the economic track, again, without being doctrinaire and saying all free markets, all state, no. We need different degrees of participation of private and public actors in the economy, depending on the sector, depending on the business cycle, depending on your geography. But you don't want everything to be super concentrated and monopolized just by the top bureaucrats and 30 families. This produces later pathologies. This is what the stereotypical liberal democracy is. What does Mexico look like compared to this open access? Mexico is part of what is called limited access. What is this access about? Access is having everyone on average having the same economic and political rights to do as we please within the law. Within the law. In Mexico, as a consequence of the hollowing out, the weakening of the state, the penetration of the state by organized crime, by the largest the billionaires, the equivalent of the Russian oligarchy, without being as distinctively identified as there. And we end up with a very weak state and with many groups, which end up at dramatic disadvantage. Here, probably the most gruesome of them, the tens of thousands of Mexican women who are kidnapped, disappeared, tortured, and assassinated on a daily basis. In a working state, this does not happen. And this is only one group. Indigenous, Native American Indian groups, Afro descendants, Afro-Mexican descendant groups, groups within the blue-collar working class. There are many, many groups which do not have that guarantee of basic access, so not open access, limited access, to simply be able to safeguard their most basic physical security, their integrity, their dignity as a human being. That is not guaranteed. So that's on the political track why Mexico is limited access. On the economic track, you see the game of monopoly. That cartoon is the richest, Mexico's richest man. At some point, 2 or 3 years, maybe not in a row, but 2 or 3 years, richest man on the planet, and fought with Bill Gates a few years on who was top, super top. For any Mexican to find that a person in their country is the richest person in the planet, that's highly problematic. This is a country where 50% of the people live under the poverty line, where the minimum wage, hourly wage, is $250. And Mexicans would go around boasting about having the richest man in the planet. To me, that's a hideous indictment. Now, this is just one example. It's not just one person, but there aren't 500 or 2,000. It's highly concentrated, and 50 families based in Mexico City, Guadalajara, Puebla, León, Monterrey, 5-6 cities concentrate 90% of economic activity. So we end up in a limited access order in Mexico. I'm about to finish, Justin, and
You're
and
perfectly on time.
thank you so much. And opening up. What does this mean? This diagnosis of misplaced monopolies, having a situation of open access, where on average we all enjoy basic political and economic freedoms, crucially physical integrity, dignity of the human being, versus places where this doesn't happen. It's like two different planets. And so in the case of Mexico, today, we end up with a country facing this pathology, small, hollowed out, captured state, very concentrated domestic economy, and the outgoing government, which is a leftist progressive government, which is very popular, which was elected back in 2018. Mexico is a presidential system, is one where elections are prescribed. There's a calendar, you assume power this day, you step down this day. It's 6 years, no re-election. The point is we have a relatively long term, but without the re-election. No, it's not 4 + 4, potentially, as the US, or 5 + 5, as in France. It's just 1-6. So coming to today, what changed was that system of neoliberalism, if you want, on the economic track, and of multi-party competition. The left wins big in 2018. For the first time in decades, since the early 80s, a president's victories with more than 50% of the national vote, 53%. Previous 4 presidents had won the presidency. There's no second round in elections. Had won the election with 35, 40, 45%. So they're minority presidents, but because we're not a parliamentary regime, you do not need to formally form coalition government. You can end up, you were the top, you were the one who won the most votes. Even if you won less than 50, you are the boss for 6 years. So this new project, which is a left-wing project, is trying on the one hand to ameliorate, to not necessarily freeze or pause, but to put the brakes on the extent to which economic activity in the country has been allowed to be in private hands, be it of domestic or foreign capitalists. It's a government that believes more in rectorship, rectorship of the economy by the state. I mean, in and of itself, that should not bring huge alarms. Most of the continental European countries, traditionally speaking, their political culture has important elements of statism, and the state has been very important in promoting economic growth, development, and managing to create societies which are relatively prosperous with welfare state, etc. So, re-embracing statism might be anathema, or might be a really bad news for those people who were or remain enamored with the neoliberal recipe that markets know best and that free markets allocate the resources best. That's the economic track. By the way, no major real reforms. If you're thinking, if you're thinking in Europe about a progressive coalition in power, center-left coalition, you can be sure that social democrats, socialists are going to try to gain more public resources to redistribute. That's natural. For corporate tax, for individual income tax of the richest to go up, to continue the sustainability of progressive redistribution. Okay. In Mexico, this left-wing government did not touch the fiscal code. They did not implement a progressive fiscal reform. They said, we will continue to use the resources that we have, and the one thing we will do is we will go very, very aggressively against tax evasion. They were pretty successful at that after sending a couple of people preventative jail, a few days behind bars, really rich people who before that would have never thought anyone could or would dare touch them. Everyone started paying. And so the state manages to finance itself, but thanks to a big, submerged iceberg of tax evasion, where a majority of the well or really well-to-do people, to the extent possible, don't pay. The government ended up managing to push against that, which was important because it helped bring inequality levels down, because it created a strong constituency which now has guaranteed income, not a lot, but guaranteed income every month. They're not just living hand to mouth. And so is there any surprise that that recipe, a recipe of redistribution, is politically popular, remains politically popular? Of course not. It makes perfect sense. One of the questions is it sustainable? Can you continue to meet all these new promises, all these entitlements, which particularly are helping the poor, the lower middle class? That's great. How are you going to keep, you're squeezing now everyone who was not paying taxes. Are you not going to raise taxation? If that is the case and you are a leftist alternative, there is something wrong with you, number one. The main issue for me, that's the economic story, but moving to the political track, and this is the core. We see that with this left-wing government, 2018 to 2024, towards the end of the term, and in traditional political history in Mexico, the transfer of power tends to follow some unwritten rules, informal, let's call them norms. The outgoing president is not going to engage in major fireworks, is not going to do something incredibly controversial to then leave a young new president deal with disaster. It's not always the case, but that's been the norm. In this case, what we see is the outgoing president with this progressive, although as I said, I question the label leftist. There's progressive policy, but in fact, the style of leadership, the person himself is deeply reactionary, old school macho Mexicano, which is really horrible. I was there, I lived there, and left 30 years ago and never went back. Just to visit, not to live. And this guy, towards the end, when in theory you need to promote soft landing, create new agreements, try to reach out to promote building bridges between the majority, which is solidly left-wing, Morena, the party of the ex-president, and now his heir, first Mexican presidenta in history, Claudia Sheinbaum. But he ends up like playing for broke and decides to, before stepping down, carrying out some pretty controversial reforms. Remember, talking now about the political track. One is to change how the judicial branch is staffed, and changing from an appointment system based, like Justin said, on relative merit, with many problems, issues of nepotism, tends to run in families, families of doctors, families of accountants, families of lawyers. There's a lot of social networks that keep reproducing positions, in this case of power. You can, as a judge, you're deciding between the liberty or jail for a person, for example. So it's not that the system was clean, but the system has always been corrupt. This is something that's in Spanish say, es un secreto a voces. It's an open, hollered secret. Justice can be bought in Mexico, much more often than not. What buys you justice, meaning the way you want a judicial case to go, is either money and or influence, relationship with powerful people. Those people win 80–90% of the cases. So the previous system wasn't good, but this reform is not going to make it better. We can get into that later. This is one first big change. And at least for the case of liberalism, liberal democracy, if you remember, one meaning of liberalism is separate central power. Do not allow political power to be concentrated because it tends to feed on itself, create positive feedbacks. More power begets more power, begets more power, more likely than not. Let's separate power. Let's create checks and balances. That's a core of liberal constitutionalism. In this case, what we see is that through this new system whereby judges will be popularly elected, superficially you might say, hey, that's great. You're deepening democracy. You're deepening participation by people to choose who governs them in the executive and the legislature and also in the judiciary. If only that was the case. The main point is to allow all the judiciary to be elected, the people who have all the resources, institutional, organizational resources to mobilize people for them to go, show up and vote are the established political groups. And now the leftist, the progressive one, Morena, is, let's say, 2/3 of the spectrum. So because they're 2/3, they're more than majority, the likelihood is that they are going to end up staffing the judiciary with people who are with them, people who agree with their perspective, with their ideology. That obviously would make the idea of neutrality that liberal constitutionalism is predicated on. A second very worrying one is a reform to the Guardia Nacional, which is the equivalent of the Carabinieri here, so a national police force. And the reform in this case is transferring this jurisdiction from the civilian rule, from a civilian minister who's appointed by the president, and this person, this lady, this man, whoever takes on board is civilian. And of course, everything civilian therefore applies to the police. Change it and pass it to military jurisdiction. The militarization of public security, of citizen security, of security in the streets, giving it to the military is a terrible idea. The military have their own courts. They don't have to be judged by civilian courts in case of abuses, of which there are thousands documented. This clearly runs more in favor of this idea of limited access, giving even more power to certain groups who already possess a lot of power, i.e. the top brass, the military, in a type of public activity which should be quintessentially run by civilians, police. Two more, and we're about to finish. As part of this big enchilada, this big plate of heavy Mexican food, the president also says, all these regulatory agencies that were created since the country became democracy, early 2000s, and you opened up economy and you want to kind of standardize your procedures, you want to do benchmarking to look, a bit like Britain, like the US, like Switzerland, at least in areas like finance, economics, those highly technocratic areas. You need merit-based regulatory agencies which overlook how the executive branch, how the presidency and its ministries are performing in the key areas of everyday life for any citizen: oil, gas, electricity, telecoms, finance, access to credit, the equivalent of Freedom of Information Act, which Mexico adopted in 2001, too. Many autonomous agencies staffed not by party people. In fact, prerequisites: you could not have been a member of a political party ever, or have participated in politics aside from voting. So many of these agencies, which gained significant amount of credibility, particularly on the outside, with the outside world, with the OECD and the IMF and the big management funds, let's disappear them. Let the ministries absorb them. The rationale there is they're just a waste of public money. These guys, simply because they're nerds and have PhDs, earn 200 times more than the average Mexicano, Mexicana. That's unfair. Let's get rid of them. But then they're also here weakening another liberal arm. Liberal arm meaning holding power accountable, keeping track of everyday public life, and as an autonomous energy, being able to say there's collusion here, there's been stealing here, there have been abuses by military or civilian police here. Let's reabsorb that back into the state. Another big hit against liberal democracy, but as it says there, this is under discussion. The previous two I mentioned are already fait accompli. They've been legislated by Congress, by the majority of Congress. President signed them. They're now law. We have to live with that and see what happens. The last one, and this is critical, to the extent that not just some of these agencies that overlook hydrocarbons or banking or telecoms, to the extent that the electoral authority is also changed in the same direction as the judiciary. The idea is, let's bring our electoral authorities closer to the people. Let the people choose their electoral authorities. Who's going to do the choosing? Who's going to create the lists? What are the funnels that are going to end with a list with a rank of 3, 4, 5 people? What they will reflect is the current political balance of power in the country, which is 2/3 progressive left, 1/3 liberal conservative reactionary. This last one, under discussion, in my view, is the most delicate, because this is the one which, if it changes and we end up again with a partisan-based electoral authority, even electoral democracy dies in the country. Conclusions: how endangered is liberal democracy in Mexico? Let's start with the most basic fact and say Mexico has never been a liberal democracy, because an effective liberal democracy safeguards rule of law, follows the principle of legality, equality before the law, regardless of who you are. That is not, has not been, and remains not the case in Mexico. The country, nonetheless, is an electoral democracy. It isn't liberal, but it is an electoral democracy. democracy with its many issues as well, but remains up until now, since those last reforms, late 90s, early 2000s, relatively free and fair. That's why if the electoral authority is changed and parties and groups manage to put in place a majority in that Instituto Nacional of Elections, we end up with the ancien regime, with the previous regime of closed elections. The dice are loaded in favor of the current majority. Main dangers. The top one for the core of democracy is the potential capture of electoral institutions. If the current Consejo, council, which is made up of expert citizens, people who could not have a political party career, who have not served in public sector, most of them professors, basically. If you get rid of them, and we just get elected people, those who will be elected will reflect the current balance of power, which today is 2/3 left. In 10, 15, 20 years' time, things change, societies change. What if, and this is one of the things that conservatives are telling the left, you are playing for broke, you are just all or nothing. If in 10 or 15 years it's us who are 2/3 and you guys, progressives, are 1/3, how would you like it if we pass elections or use these reforms you've made to stack the core institutions of the state with our loyalists? What's left in between? Where are the bridges that are required for relative neutrality in politics and policy? Militarization of public order and security, as mentioned in the previous slide, changing jurisdiction for Carabinieri, Guardia Nacional, to be managed by the top brass, by the military, should be deeply troubling to anyone interested seriously in human rights, in civil rights, and a potential for accountability by state forces who violate the rights of citizens. The military are very opaque, they're not in that business. The last one, going to the core of liberalism, or the idea of liberal democracy, to the extent that with these elections for the judiciary, which will start next year, June 2025, then the danger there is to at least this first wave of new legal public servants, judges, magistrates, ministers, the justices, the equivalent of Supreme Court justices are called ministros, just underneath are the magistrados, and underneath jueces, judges. If all this system is up for grabs electorally, it would be unsurprising if the current majority stacks the judiciary with supporters, with allies, and therefore the idea of neutral implementation of the law, of law enforcement beyond political colors or preferences, continues to be absent in the country. Thank you so much.
Francisco, thank you. Thank you very much. Before I open up for Q&A, let me just underline two things. Professor González underlined that probably Mexico has never been a fully fledged liberal democracy. However, it should be said that in comparative constitutional terms, there are two things that have emerged from Mexico that are extremely important. One goes back to the 1800s, and that is the famous recurso de amparo, the first type of direct complaint against abuse of power. Now, has it worked a lot in practice in Mexico? In many respects, no, but it was a legal instrument, created, I think, for the first time in the state of Yucatan, And that is an instrument that has then spread to other parts of the world, Spain, other parts of Latin America, and so on and so forth. To a certain extent, even the constitutional complaint in Germany is not dissimilar to that instrument that was invented in Mexico. Second, and I think this is really important, the issue of the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission in Mexico has been a model for many other electoral management bodies across the globe, to the extent that, thanks to the role played by this independent electoral commission, we have come up with an idea, adding to the concept of separation of powers, a separate branch which is called the electoral branch, el poder electoral. And that is something, again, that derives from Mexican constitutional law. So all of this, I'm emphasizing this because what is happening is extremely significant from a political and constitutional point of view. Ma qui mi taccio. Okay. Out to Q&A. And then I have also online as well. First, Julia.
Thank you.
Start with A.
Thank you, Professor. I have a question regarding the reforms or lack thereof of tax. Why do you think the government hasn't attacked on the big monopolists that it always is attacking in rhetoric and uses very much as like a standpoint to go against? Why do you think?
So, traditionally is not hundreds of years, but since around the Second World War, since the 1940s, the country undergoing a process of industrialization, growth of cities, growth of literacy, higher expectancy, life expectancy after birth. So a lot of things which are consonant with the idea of modernization. During this period, there is an informal alliance between state authorities and the capitalist class. The big capitalists in particular, the government says, we protect you, there are tariffs, we subsidize loans so that you can start producing radios, televisions, washing machines. We want to become modern and not just import things from the US or Netherlands or Germany. We also want it, not Mexico on its own, by the way. Brazil attempted it, Colombia, Argentina, many countries attempted it. So there is here an unwritten relation, unwritten because it wasn't formal, a dirty little secret within that old regime, because the regime claimed to be for the people, a regime that had been born after a social revolution, massive land redistribution. 1 million people died, 10% of the population of Mexico died between 1910 and 20. Big change. So the winners of that conflict, at least rhetorically, in terms of everyday engagement, we are against the oligarchy. We destroyed the oligarchy. The truth is that they required private capital to generate employment, to generate economic activity. What for? To keep a electoral constituency, people continuing to vote for you. So the private sector, in particular, two groups, the top 3-4 bankers based in Mexico City and in Monterrey, and the industrial class of Monterrey, northern Mexico, neighbor to Texas, which traditionally have been very conservative, time and again sabotaged attempts by not one, successive presidents. Even though they seem to be, it's authoritarian, these guys are all powerful, well, why can't you tax the rich? And the reason was that the rich were able to engage in, just as there are labor strikes, engage in capital strikes, stop investing, capital flight. The United States is just across the river. Send your money to Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico. And once the danger of these well-meaning populists goes away, you bring back your money. There's quite a lot, not just of symbolic, but of real threat, time and time again. The previous most leftist government before López Obrador took over in 2018, which was Luis Echeverría, we're talking about 1970, 76, the 70s, still part of the counterculture, social democratic perspectives, socialist perspectives are gaining ground. The non-aligned movement, third world countries are more taking the offensive against the idea of just a rich, prosperous north. Even that government attempted a tax reform, and the result was that the country suffered such an amount of capital flight within 2-3 months. And this is the 1970s, before markets were moved basically just by computers and algorithms. The capital strike was such that the president had to abandon the fiscal reform. So thus far, there has not been any government, left, center, or conservative, that has managed to emulate what national governments, particularly center-left governments, do in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany, to some extent, even in the US before the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And that continues to be a problem.
Alex, if you guys want to, you can say where you come from as well, if you desire to.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm from California, and I wanted to ask you if you see Sheinbaum diverging in any key ways from the general AMLO platform, or will it be more or less a complete continuation of his policies?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and as you can imagine, this is exactly what the entire press, all the newspapers, both in Mexico and outside, those who are interested in focusing on Mexico, are asking. Are these issues, are these 4 things going to be implemented? How deeply will these things happen? So far, it's very early days. The new president just assumed power 11 days ago, October the 1st, so this month. And up until now, she's just continued to follow the ex-president's script. I think she and her close group of advisors are very aware that the magnitude of the victory that she managed to gain is very strongly linked to the ex-president. If he won with more than 50% and was the first one since the 1980s to win so big, well, now his heir, his directly chosen heir, Presidenta Claudia Sheinbaum, won with close to 61%. So 8% even more than López Obrador. The movement exists, this movement, Morena, Movimiento Regeneración Nacional, National Regeneration Movement, and coalesces around the leader, around López Obrador. So even though these are 2 very different types of leaders, López Obrador, as I said earlier, is an old school politician who wasn't a leftist to start with, who was a member of the PRI, like most people who make it into national politics in Mexico. There's much more often than not that original sin of at some point having toyed with the PRI. He's one of them, and he represents this very provincial, macho style of politics. The current president, on the other hand, is cosmopolitan. The people who are around her are all, people between 40s and early 60s. The vast majority are masters, PhDs. Most of them are bilingual, trilingual, polyglot. She is a scientist herself. She is a physicist with a PhD from Berkeley in energy policy and politics, and a very, very competent person, surrounded by competent people. They are a younger generation compared to that of López Obrador and this outgoing group who are in their 70s, some even in their 80s. So even though there's this novelty, the current correlation of forces and control of the streets still rests with López Obrador. He's not showing himself on television, but control of the streets, control of the popular movement is still in his hands. So I am unsurprised that the new president is trying to rock the boat as least as possible, trying to find her feet, trying to find who is an ally, who is an ally adversary, who is an ally mortal enemy. This is going to take some time, but at least in terms of policy making, I think you can expect across the board to return to a more evidence-based process in public decision making, not just ideological, not just in terms of the wordsmith capabilities of the old, very charismatic caudillo. No, these people are technocrats. They will engage with anyone and everyone and will hold their head high. And this is not insignificant because for 6 years, Mexico suffered a very dramatic reversal in policymaking, formulation, implementation, with lots of people just being chosen on the basis of political loyalty. The president, ex-president himself, said it many times. He didn't even hide it. I need 90% loyalty, 10% capability. Openly and proud of that. Saying, I'm more Machiavellian than Machiavelli. I'm the toughest and best. Well, you are 3 or 4 generations behind the times. Go back to your ranch. Thank you. Hasta luego. But this newer generation, which is staffed by people based on aptitude, experience, cannot operate freely to the extent that the movement, Morena, which is 2/3 of the current political landscape, remains very deeply tied loyally, in terms of loyalty, to the president who stepped down.
Here and then in the middle. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Yael. I'm from the US, but I have roots in Latin America, not Mexico. I have a question a bit about the secondary legislation, which I think went through this week, and it might be a little granular, but the legislation that I think it was the Senate passed this week to kind of clarify some vacuums, like legal vacuums regarding the judicial overhaul. They were supposed to clarify the process. I looked over it, it looks like it's actually more confusing. Do you think the issues concerning like democratic backsliding have some amount to do with these kind of vacuums and confusing situations where the administration can kind of use loopholes to manipulate the process? Or do you think no matter how it's implemented, it would still be a problem for democracy?
Thank you so much. That is such a central concern for people interested in liberal democracy and constitutionalism. First, I think you're absolutely right in conceiving of this moment as an unstable equilibrium, because we've just had an administration that stepped down and is now leaving, and just a new one. A lot of things, a lot of like circus jugglers. There are lots of balls in the air currently, but in the light of these changes, which are not just about how my mood is, I'm the president, I'm happy, then I'll do nice things for some people. Today I'm really angry. It doesn't rely just on agency. These are fundamental legal changes to the Constitution, to the top law of the land. So in this sense, as you point out, there is an unstable equilibrium, because even though we have the constitutional reforms, and reforming a constitution, wherever you come from, I'm sure you're aware, is not something that happens just because. You require to garner coalitions, to bring together, to engage in significant give and take, quid pro quos, to change fundamental laws. To the extent that this, the top one there, the judiciary branch reform passed, yes, as our colleague here is telling us, one thing is the new wording in the Constitution. That's one, and that's done. Now, how is that new top law going to operate on the ground? That's what's called secondary legislation, and it's how do you guarantee that this new general law, citizens choose judiciary, how does it happen? Incredibly, it's like a minefield, because it's a fine print. How is it? When are people going to be able to choose judges? How long will these judges be in power? How do you make up the lists? Do they have to be lawyers? Or you know, there's so many things in the air. And as you say, at least currently, in the light of the configuration of political forces in Mexico, with Morena, progressive leftism being 55, 60, 2/3 of the political representation in the country, the not insignificant minority, 35, 40% of people who dislike that. In fact, one of the issues that's happened in Mexico is the hollowing out of the middle, of people who can simply say, you know, I'm a bit indifferent, I don't care. Everyone has become very intensely focused on either liking what's in place, Morena, López Obrador, his agenda, or hating it. So political polarization. In these circumstances, at least in terms of just process, the number of votes that have to be taken in the two chambers of Congress, etc., they will pass because they have those 2/3 plus. In what that does to the entire country, to the 35, 40% of people who dislike it, is at the very least strengthen their dislike for this winner-take-all style of politics, threatening, of course, the system with injunctions, with amparos, Justin was referring to, freeze the application of a law because there have been all these violations before it became law. So before passing that judiciary branch law, let's look at the process, how this was passed in both chambers. There are always procedural issues. Lawyers are very good at following them. And to the extent that they find issue with any of them, if any of those parts of the process violated the Constitution, it could freeze some of the application of this law. So the really sad thing is that we don't have a critical mass somewhere in the middle, left and right-wing moderates willing to compromise and work together on, okay, now this is the constitutional law, let's try to have minimum agreement that takes into account all the major political forces, not just one side. To the extent that that happens, and this is what some of these conservative people today are saying, they say, okay, the name of the game then is revenge. If in 15 or 20 years we are 2/3, we're going to do exactly what you're about to do, which is, create a judiciary branch that's loyal first and foremost to you as a person, as a movement, rather than to the law itself. So early days, a lot of uncertainty. I share my concern with you.
Okay, this might be a bit of a follow-on. I'll be with you in a second. We have a question online by Alejandra Flores. Would you say that if the changes to the Electoral Commission pass now, a shift in political power in the future might really revisit these changes, or would they just set them and they become a long-lasting potential for abuse of power?
that goes to the heart of the issue of, will Mexico remain a democracy?
Yeah.
And free and fair elections continue to be guaranteed if, as in the judiciary branch, changes to the composition of the National Electoral Commission were to happen. If the same principle, which, as I was saying before, it's easy to sell politically to people, to liberals, to progressives, to say, bring government closer to the people, let them elect as many authorities as possible, not just the president, not just your Congress, women and men, now judges, also people who overlook elections. Well, the problem is that staffing, and that staffing is not for life. Whenever it changes, what we can expect is for the composition of these bodies to reflect the majority that is in power. Currently, it's a leftist progressive alternative. Could it, as mentioned, in 5, 10, 15 years, swing completely to the other side and end up with the right-wing, radical, reactionary forces? Maybe. And if that was to be the case, then you end up with no democracy, because the arbiter, who are these citizen councillors who oversee all the elections, if now they're basically chosen by and then sent to the electorate just to, like a plebiscite, please say yes, we are the top, you end up with elections in the hands either of now the left, in the future maybe of the right, then the basic principle of free and fair elections disappears, and thus Mexico returns to authoritarian rule, which I hope does not happen.
Yeah.
Hello,
Questions
Professor.
do we have? Just to have a,
Yeah.
okay, right. Go ahead.
Firstly, thank you so much for the session. I'm Prathul from India. I have a question which is very inspired from Narcos, Mexico.
Yes.
My question is, you've talked about something very important. You said 30 years ago it was insiders versus outsiders. It was not capitalists versus workers. Now, Professor, it seems to be as insiders versus insiders, because we have Sinaloa cartel versus the Jalisco new cartel. We have politicians who want to express their opinions, and Mexico today, right now, is the most dangerous city, the most dangerous country if you want to be a politician, because the number of politician killings have been significant. I was wondering, in the midst of these situations, how can we strengthen the institutions? Because you've just talked about something very interesting, which is merit-based regulation agencies. So I was just thinking, if I was an individual and I'm really passionate, but I go on the street and I don't know, next minute I might just get, shot, or I know that's not the case, but if it's very risky for me, then how could we probably inspire, or how could we make sure that the situation continues, that we have some sort of democracy flourishing? Thank you.
Thank you for that, and for touching on what to many Mexicans on the ground, living their everyday life, is the core. They're not necessarily thinking about the constitutional reforms and the 3 branches of government. They're thinking about, can I go out to my supermarket? Can my children go to school and I can fetch them and we return in peace home? The country is not at war, but many cities suffer from endemic, indiscriminate violence, where thousands of innocent people end up getting caught in crossfire, usually between the main organized criminal syndicates, which control all manner of trafficking, narcotics, human beings. They're the number 1 smugglers of people into the United States. Weapons, just as they get humans to the US, for the US to get more cheap labor, they bring back south heavy weaponry from the United States. They're into all trafficking, illegal activity. So as you say, what's the level of confidence of at least basic predictability that you can offer your population? The answer to that is that the Mexico I grew up with in the 1970s, 1980s, everything was centralized. The military were not in power. It was civilian, but the president had an incredible amount of power and power to transmit orders, to pick up a phone, call a governor and say, this is happening in this town, in this city, stop it now. And people would comply because the authority pyramid was very, very clear. There was one person at the top. Everyone knew that they would step down 6 years later, but everyone's jobs depended on doing well with this person. And that's how the political class continued to move up. It paid to be nice, to be good to the president. With democracy, which at least prescriptively we should prefer to closed authoritarian rule, a problem becomes that the president now does not have that amount of power because power is quite fragmented. There are governors of 3, 4 different parties, not just one party. There are governors who will not take the president's telephone call and will brag about it and will say, I'm not talking to this corrupt, even if there's a core public good at stake, the public good of basic security in the streets. And so we all lose. Politicians do not cooperate, and the problem continues or reproduces itself, becomes worse. So one is decentralization of power, fragmentation, with incapacity for a single head or a given cockpit of decision-making, being able to call the shots throughout the territory. That changed. Remaking it, making it happen again sounds incredibly complex. I think that the government that just stood down thought that second reform here in the slide, transferring police jurisdiction duties to the military will create a more effective, faster responses. But as the people say, the military are trained to fire and ask questions later. They pull the trigger first. They're used to just fulfilling a mission accomplished, and his mission is exterminate that. You will later find out what was it, but the main thing is you eliminate the threat. That is an area which should remain very much in the hands of civilian-based police, of a strong social policy that in particular focused on very poor areas where most of the young people get recruited into the criminal syndicates. And even that is not how to build a police force, an effective police force that follows the rule of law. Each of the presidencies, since the problem with organized crime, particularly with the drug trafficking cartels, since things worsened, and the worsening started late 1990s, early 2000s, every government, the outgoing one, which is in theory leftist, progressive, before them, the one in the center, the PRI, which in theory controlled everything or had controlled things for many years, the more traditional conservative party, PAN, all of them had at least a shot at the presidency and are trying to address the issue of citizen security, of public basic security. No one has managed to crack areas that were pacified during some periods. Certain border cities like Ciudad Juárez, like Tijuana, later on ended up again undergoing bouts of dramatic violence. So the problem, and this is how some of the experts, some of the police or military that I sometimes come across in Washington, DC, and are looking at Mexico and and trying to look at this, they say if the Mexican tragedy in this area resembles this balloon effect where, when you have a balloon and you're just pinching on it, the air will simply redistribute. So all police or military-based operations, they can go into a town, they can go into a city, but they cannot become a permanent force of occupation. So they go there in an emergency, they might stay for a few days, they leave, and then things can easily revert to what was going on. Or if some places are considered so strategic, Mexico City compared to rest of Mexico, does not have as high murder rates per 100,000 inhabitants as many other cities in the country. When I was growing up in the 70s, 1980s, Mexico City was the most insecure city in the country. There was a lot of urban-based crime. Now it isn't. So the authorities can manage to create significant deterrence capability, but by no means throughout the territory. It's in strategic points, usually the core of the major cities where most of the money, the economic activity takes place. But the criminal syndicates, as in the balloon, if there's big operation, they'll simply move out, lie low. And of course, these are not armies, right? So it's not a war where you can identify one side or the other because people are wearing uniforms with a flag and are fighting over a country. They're fighting over money, over business. So for the vast majority of these people, you would not be able to recognize them in the street because they look like you, like me, like everyone around here. They look like citizens. They're not dressed, they're not carrying flags, promoting a political ideology. They want to continue making as much money as they can and willing to, if necessary, carry out as gruesome violence as necessary to retain the control for their trafficking routes.
Okay, as the bells have started ringing, I think we have to sort of draw to a close, but I want to gather the last few questions, so we'll gather them together. I think you've answered Ricardo Guadarrama's question about organized crime and its effects on Mexico's system. He wanted to congratulate you, by the way. And then we have last question online, Mario Coronado. How do you see the influence of these changes in other countries in Latin America? Will they be replicated? And then, Marie. Oh, sorry, Anna, you've got the, no, Anna.
All right.
Then Marie, and then Alexandra at the back, I think, and then we can close.
Okay, I'll be very quick. My name is Hannah. Thank you for the excellent talk. Maybe this question stems from my lack of familiarity with the Mexican system, but I was wondering, I read that there's still some constitutional challenges which have been brought against the reform. So you write there, reform of the judicial branch done. Is it really done, or could it still be reversed?
Marie?
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is just around the popular response. Has there been a pushback? And if there has been, or actually if there hasn't been, does that have an incidence on how far these reforms will go and what will actually be able to happen?
Right. And this would be popular responses against such bold constitutional changes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Last but not least, Alexander.
Thank you, Professor. So my question is just a little bit shorter. Given the overhaul of all this system and the popular election of judges, what liberties from the Constitution are at risk, if any, and sort of what fundamental rights and what make the Mexican Constitution strong are at risk from the popular vote?
Thank you so much for all those questions. Influence in other countries. Within the orbit of Latin America, Mexico is considered a latecomer in electing an openly left-wing government with massive electoral support. So many other countries, it's in the course of the 90s and 2000s, elected left-wing governments. Left-wing governments, of course, of different persuasions. Some moderate, relatively pragmatic, like Lula in Brazil, like Tabaré Vázquez or Pepe Mujica in Uruguay, like left-wing multi-party government in Chile. So some have been moderate, others have been more radical. And López Obrador is not necessarily, he and now the current government, he isn't necessarily an endorser of either the hard left, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, or the moderate left. He would consider himself, among the people who profess Latin American solidarity, multilateral agreements to diffuse conflict, some distance from, in spite of being so connected to the US, economically speaking, keep some distance, not allow just the US to be the largest investor in the country, diversify the portfolio, keep inviting Western European countries. Spain is a huge investor in Mexico. Italy has important investments, Germany, Japan and South Korea. So, the idea here is Mexico needs to diversify a bit more. So I think that Obrador doesn't fall neatly within the categories. Diplomatically, he was very politically incorrect, openly, by inviting leaders who the international community considers dictators. President of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel, that is una dictadura, dictadura del pueblo, question mark, to invite President Maduro of Venezuela, President Ortega of Nicaragua, all of whom are openly dictators. He invited them time and again for symbolic celebrations, particularly trying to use, these more than anything symbolic actions to create a linchpin between the prosperous North, US, Canada, Western Europe. Yes, we depend on you. You're the main source of capital for us, and you're our most important consumer market. But we want, in the international sphere, to remain relatively independent, to remain non-aligned, and by no means being pro-US or whatever the US chooses. Another controversial perspective, no major criticism of the Russian invasion of Ukraine by this government. So influence in other countries, evidently Mexico is now seen as part of the group of countries where left-wing governance has taken root. But what happens there? Well, there are different trajectories. And simplifying, the moderate trajectory looks a bit more like Brazil during the presidencies of Lula, or as mentioned, the left in power in Uruguay or in Chile. More radical, more controversial, winner-take-all approaches would be those of Venezuela, Bolivia under Evo Morales, Ecuador under Rafael Correa, and López Obrador is a consummate populist who, a bit like the leopard and the spots, can play any number of games to ensure a core objective, which is to remain popular with 50+ of Mexicans, something which so far has happened. So certainly, to the extent that Mexico is second largest country in the region, the continuation of leftist progressive politics will continue to have strong backing from the country.
And those constitutional complaints and the popular reaction.
Yes, reversal of judiciary, popular response. So on the reversal of the judiciary, thank you for the question. As mentioned earlier, it's a long-term process, and one phase, the core, the critical phase, which was can this outgoing government get a supermajority, which is 2/3 of members in both federal chambers of Congress, to change the Constitution? They did that. They passed that. What lawyers from the opposition, members of political parties from the opposition, groups in civil society, a popular response connected a bit to this, to the extent that they are very scared about what this does, what doors this opens up. We don't know, we haven't been there. And there are not many other examples that we can look at to avoid pitfalls, to follow best practice. There isn't. So currently, to the extent that this is not going to be reversed, at least for some time, judiciary will be elected by people. What 2/3, which is progressive left, and the significant minority, which is 40% of Mexico, to the extent that we are all part of Mexico, there is some hope that during the process, which our colleague earlier referred to, the drafting of the secondary legislation, which is spell out how this general rule will operate. In implementation, the hope is that both groups manage to reach at least a minimum of consensus regarding the appointments, in order that not all of the appointments are so skewed in one direction or the other. If that is to happen, then what ends up being at stake is the core credibility of the country. If there's no credibility for contract enforcement, forget extra investment from anywhere. Who wants to invest in a place where national government is captured by a single force? Popular response connected to judiciary changes, to passing civilian police to military hands. This is a fascinating, sadly fascinating issue, to the extent that it's the two largest parties of Mexico for many, many years. The PRI, which ruled 7 decades uninterruptedly, the PAN, conservative Catholic, which was born in 1938 against the idea of the creation of a socialist education system for children back in the 30s, and they were successful. That was killed. These two main parties are now, very sad and weak shades of what they used to be. What we've ended up with is a highly fragmented opposition, groups that are competing with one another rather than adding themselves to create a common front. That has not happened. Many analysts, and I have no reason to doubt this, most analysts are saying those brands are bankrupt. The brand of PRI, the brand of PAN, in the light of the ferocious criticism by this new left, by Morena, by López Obrador. So those are always going to be tinged with epithets, corrupt, nepotist, gangsters. So there is a very important question regarding, can Mexican civil society build a strong enough and together enough opposition that can work together to build some bridges to reach out to this majority. There is a majority which is progressive leftist, but there's a sizable minority which currently is disorganized, whose economic interests are not necessarily all aligned. But yeah, following our classic political science texts, the idea of polyarchy, opposition is as important as government for the quality of governance. Currently, we see a very weak, divided, demoralized opposition, but the country remains at least open for business, remains ruled by civilian, although with some crawling military influence, very dangerous on that side. And lastly, to Alexander on, what are some of the main issues that are at stake for the average Mexican as a citizen? The basic guarantee of the most basic civil rights, the right to be in the streets, taking your physical security for granted. Our colleague here, our Indian colleague, who reminded us about Mexico being one of the most or the most dangerous country for journalists to work with the highest number of murdered or disappeared journalists for years in a row, more than countries that are experiencing war as we speak. So core rights such as freedom of expression, freedom to physical integrity and security, freedom to participate in politics, so moving from civil to political rights. Again, our colleague was absolutely spot on, sadly, in highlighting that in national elections, be them the presidential every 6 years, or the midterms every 3, to change part of Congress. In each of these, it's become normalized to reading the newspapers that, after the electoral campaigns, 3 months of campaigns, 95, 100 candidates assassinated. What are you talking about? That did not used to happen. That did not used to happen in the 80s or 90s. And I'm no nostalgic of authoritarian rule, I promise you. I don't like it. But the new democracy is weak, is currently captured by a power bloc that doesn't seem to want to play, let's bargain. I get A, but you also get B, C, D. We seem to be in a situation in which it's winner take all, which at the end of the day forces that minority potentially to radicalize and to look for radical solutions to a majority that is not willing to meet you somewhere in the middle, at least in some areas of policy. So big concern, the extent to which the opposition can radicalize, and there are people openly, traditional conservative elites, openly asking for the US government to send troops to the highlands in Western Mexico to fight the drug cartels. That again is something that you would have not heard 10, 15, 20, 30 years, not at all. So to the extent that the opposition feels weaker, more marginalized, more vulnerable, it raises the possibility that they end up also trying to embrace radical solutions to, rather than engage, take over the system and then staff them with their own people. End up in a system of winner take all, and no one cooperates, and rather than being adversaries, we are enemies. That's a recipe for disaster for the present and the future of any country. Thank you.
Okay, I've saved one. Hang on. I've saved one for the end. And this is Todd Holland. I don't know whether this rings a bell. I'm a SAIS MA grad from 2006, and Dr. González was one of my professors. Ask him if he misses me.
So out of course I miss you, Todd. Of course I miss you. Of the colleagues here who asked questions on the webinar, the previous one, we said Guadarrama, someone I went to undergraduate school with, 1990, a long time ago, and Todd Holland, with whom I'm sure I shared the good wine and beer alongside other students. So that's an adamant yes. I miss you, Todd.
Okay, I'm afraid, Todd, talking about wine and beer, we are about to have a little aperitivo. It's a shame you can't join us. I told you, Francisco, Estão back.
Hombre.
Back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Cheers.
Join us in the back.
Vengo in
Thank you, Todd. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Hi. Oh.
Guys, help yourself, the back. It's a little aperitivo offered by